What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the quarterback position for week 6 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, really does help us out when you guys hit that like button and consider subscribing, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Commanders at the Bears. Lately, I've been trying to kind of stray away from these Thursday night games. Just overall, they're not giving us the best fantasy game scripts, but we've got a couple teams on bye week this week. So the Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, the Raiders, and the Titans. So no Jared Goff out there, no Davis Mills, not really hurting us there, but no Derek Carr and no Ryan Tannehill. Probably won't affect a majority of fantasy managers, but for those of you guys who play in deeper leagues, super flex leagues, or double quarterback leagues, and trust me, there are definitely rosters out there in 12 and 10 man formats for managers who went zero quarterback and have Derek Carr and Jared Goff on their roster, like this guy in one of my leagues. So I'm going to have some streaming options throughout today's video, is the moral of the story here. So Carson Wentz, I do think, is a streaming option on the week. I encourage you guys to stream him last week against the Tennessee Titans. He put up 22.8 fantasy points, 359 passing yards, 2 scores overall, 1 interception. It's not a Carson Wentz game if he doesn't have a turnover of some sorts. He had 15 rushing yards on the ground. Guys, I get it. You know, weeks 3 and 4 were awful, but Philadelphia and Dallas are playing phenomenal defense at the moment. The Chicago Bears are playing awful defense, but they're not playing at the level of Philadelphia or Dallas. And Carson Wentz is your quarterback 9 on the season. So if you're in a pickle, I do think that Carson Wentz is perfectly fine to stream here in week 6. All right, let's talk about Justin Fields, who had a really improved day overall against Minnesota Vikings in week 5. Nothing crazy to see here, but 15 completions off 21 passing attempts, 208 passing yards, a score, and 47 rushing yards, and then just 17.02 fantasy points. That's his highest on the season so far. He now has at least 47 rushing yards in his last 3 games. And most importantly, in week 5, Justin Fields had no turnovers. He just looked a lot more comfortable out there. So I'm not purely confident in throwing Justin Fields in my starting lineup by any means. I'm not quite confident enough to consider him a streaming option, but he's definitely a quarterback we want to keep a strong eye on against a very bad Washington Commanders defense here in week 6. All right, moving on to Sunday's slate, we've got the Ravens at the Giants. Lamar Jackson is your quarterback 2 in fantasy football. He continues to be a must-start on a weekly basis. It's worth noting that the last 2 weeks have been a complete downward trend in comparison to the first 3 weeks of the season. 15.06 points in week 4, 15.76 in week 5 for Jackson. But hey, it doesn't really matter, guys. Like, I'm not going to read into this really at all. If you own Lamar Jackson, you're starting him. The Giants looked good last week. I mean, I really don't care who Lamar Jackson is facing. I expect him to bounce back in the next couple of weeks, and he's in your starting lineups on a weekly basis. Speaking of the Giants, looking pretty good last week against the Green Bay Packers. You know, they're not playing bad football on the season so far. For the majority of the season, there's still been some Giants moments, but overall, Danny Dimes, not a great performance in week 5, but really no mistakes on the day, right? 217 passing yards, 37 rushing yards, no touchdowns, no fumbles, no interceptions. So not a great fantasy day, but he did a good job of managing the game. In week 4, he had 21 fantasy points. That was his best performance of the season. Outside of that, he hasn't had more than 16 points on the season. The Ravens have not played great defensively, although they played much better in week 5. So like I said at the beginning of the video, this is more of a desperate stream in super flex leagues and double quarterback leagues, or if you're just in an absolute pickle. Outside of that, I do think for a majority of fantasy owners moving into week 6, we are sitting Daniel Jones. All right, Jaguars at Colts. Man, oh man, Trevor Lawrence. I really expected big things out of T-Law in week 5. I really thought he was going to be a great streaming option against the Houston Texans. He had 12.3 fantasy points, 286 passing yards, 2 interceptions, and the season high of 29 rushing yards, but overall a very bad fantasy performance. I think we sit Trevor Lawrence against the Colts here in week 6. I'm just not confident in starting him. If you absolutely have to, you could consider streaming Trevor Lawrence or even Matt Ryan in the same game for that matter, but I just don't have the confidence to roll out Trevor Lawrence in week 6. It really looks like opposing defenses are starting to get a grasp on this Jacksonville Jaguars team, and Trevor Lawrence just does not look comfortable at the quarterback position. I'm hoping for a turnaround, guys. I'm hoping I'm wrong on this one, but at the moment I don't have the confidence to recommend Trevor Lawrence in week 6. I also don't have the confidence whatsoever to recommend Matt Ryan. I mean, this could be a nice divisional matchup. We could see a good amount of points scored here, but both defenses have also been playing pretty well overall on the season. Matt Ryan doesn't have more than 18.84 fantasy points on the season. That was in week 4 against Tennessee. Every other matchup this year, he has 13.2 or less fantasy points on the season, including 3.8 points in week 2, in which he faced Jacksonville. So Matt Ryan is going to be a sit for me moving into week 6. All right, Patriots at Browns. I'm sitting the Patriots quarterbacks. Even if Mac Jones is healthy by Sunday, we're not starting Mac Jones. There's just nothing there from a fantasy perspective. And listen, man, Bailey Zappe's getting my kudos, man. He is playing good football, brought his team into overtime against the Green Bay Packers when he was thrown into the game when Brian Hoyer went down, and led his team to a victory in week 5 against Detroit. He's playing good football. He's managing this team. But at the end of the day, there's nothing relevant here from a fantasy perspective, nothing for us to talk about. Jacoby Brissett is not going to be considered outside of Superflex and double quarterback leagues, right? I mean, he's a pretty safe floor on a weekly basis. Outside of week 1, he's gotten you at least 15 points on a weekly basis, but this is probably his toughest matchup of the season with the way this New England Patriots defense is playing. So I don't like Jacoby Brissett at all unless you're 110% desperate and there's no better options in the Superflex or double QB league. All right, Bengals at Saints. Joe Burrow had his second worst fantasy performance on the season versus Baltimore in week 5. 18.2 fantasy points, 24 completions off 35 passing attempts, 217 passing yards, a touchdown, and an interception. But I don't really care, guys. Listen, if you own Joe Burrow, he's a start for me on a weekly basis. If you own a second quarterback who you have more confidence in, I think that's okay. If you have a second quarterback who has a better matchup on the week, I think that's fine. But I do think for a majority of fantasy owners, it's perfectly okay to roll with Joe Burrow here in week 6. The Saints have been playing good defense, but they've also started to give up a lot of points in the past couple of weeks. So I'm not too worried there. And Joe Burrow is still coming in as your quarterback 8 on the season. I think you continue to roll with them here in week 6. All right, I'm sitting these Saints quarterbacks because at this point in the week, I don't know who is going to be active. I don't know if Jameis Winston's going to be the starting quarterback. I don't know if it's Andy Dalton. I don't know if it's Taysom Hill. If you can play Taysom Hill at quarterback in your league, you could consider that, but still always expect a little bit of disappointment if you're rolling out Taysom Hill coming off of a 34.08 fantasy day. But in most leagues, he's going to be listed as a tight end. But in some leagues, you can play him at the quarterback position. But let's just say you can't. You got Andy Dalton or you got Jameis Winston coming off of injury. I don't see a good fantasy ceiling for either player. Dalton has not given us a good ceiling whatsoever. No more than 13.7 fantasy points in his 2 starts. And we don't know if Winston's going to be healthy. So bottom line, we're not starting Saints quarterbacks moving into week 6. All right, Bucks at Steelers. Kenny Pickett's going to be a sit for me. 15 points in week 4 for Pickett, 13 in week 5. He had 327 passing yards, 52 passing attempts, 34 completions, an interception, and added 10 yards on the ground. Listen, we saw some good flashes out of Kenny Pickett, but this is another steep matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. I don't see anything here that's going to have us leaning towards starting Kenny Pickett outside of really, really deep super flex leagues, but Pickett's a sit for me in majority of fantasy leagues here in week 6. Tom Brady starting to pick up his pace, getting back on a roll, coming in as your quarterback, 13 in fantasy at the moment. 25.4 points in week 4, 19.7 against Atlanta in week 5. I see another good floor and good enough ceiling here in week 6 for Tom Brady that he is a very solid start. I could see what we saw last week where, you know, the Buccaneers were ahead for the majority of this game and just didn't need to put a lot of points on the board. I could see a similar game script against the Steelers, or I could see what the Bills did to the Steelers last week happening, because it just feels like the Buccaneers really need a bold statement game to really prove that they are a top contender in the league. They're playing well within their division and everything, but we really just need that big offensive day, and this is kind of the right team to do it against. So regardless of if you're going for the floor or the ceiling, I like Tom Brady here in week 6. All right, Niners at Falcons. I think you can definitely consider Jimmy Garoppolo as a stream on the week, coming off of his best fantasy performance on the season, 18.2 fantasy points against Carolina, 253 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Listen, this Falcons defense has definitely shown that they are vulnerable, and I definitely think you can get a safe floor out of Jimmy Garoppolo if you need a streaming option on the week, but I don't see a very high ceiling at the end of the day. So Jimmy G, no more than a streaming option here in week 6. Marcus Mariota, on the other hand, is a sit for me, coming in as your quarterback, 19 on the season. Just not enough consistency here for me to have confidence in starting Mariota. On top of that, this Niners defense is no joke. I don't want to start any quarterback against this Niners defense unless they're an absolute, you know, stud like Allen or Mahomes or Hurts, right? So Mariota is going to be a sit for me, and he really has not been giving us good ceilings. And although we saw his rushing ability come back to life in week 5 for the first time since week 1, I'm still going to leave him as a sit. I don't want to mess with this Niners defense, so I don't think he's even worth streaming here in week 6. All right, Jets at Packers. I'm going to sit Zach Wilson. I don't have enough of a sample size to really say that he's worth starting. And we talked about Daniel Jones earlier in the video, who faced the Green Bay Packers in week 5. And he played well in that game, but we didn't see a good fantasy day out of him, right? So I don't necessarily love this matchup for Zach Wilson. I don't necessarily hate it. You know, 20.7 points in week 4 for Wilson, 14.6 against Miami. This Jets offense is just based off of feeding Breece Hall and Michael Carter, right? So Breece Hall is really coming to life. So I like the rushing attack for the Jets this week. I don't quite love Zach Wilson. I do think in Superflex and double quarterback leagues, if you absolutely needed to, you could roll with Wilson on the week if you need to, right? I got Aaron Rodgers as a start, but let's face it, if you have better options, you're starting them over Aaron Rodgers, right? If you're in a Superflex double quarterback league, anything like that, you know, you can roll with Aaron Rodgers. He's perfectly fine as your second quarterback. But if you're in a one quarterback league and you have more than one option and one of them is Aaron Rodgers, you might want to consider the other option. He's your quarterback, 18 on the season. He has not scored more than 17.1 fantasy points on the season. So safe floor here, but really no ceiling. You know, we just talked about Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers needing a statement game offensively. Well, I think the Packers are also due for a statement game offensively, and I do think we could potentially see that here in week 6. They get Washington in week 7. Maybe that's the week. So at the end of the day, man, Aaron Rodgers, safe floor for me, but really we haven't seen a good ceiling on the season. So I think he's fine to start, but if you have other options, you definitely want to consider them moving into week 6. All right, Vikings at Dolphins. Just when I drop Kirk Cousins from my fantasy team, he gives us his best fantasy performance of the entire year. He's your quarterback, 11th thus far on the season, 23.2 points in week 5, 296 passing yards, a touchdown, and an interception, and a rushing touchdown on top of that for Captain You Like That, Kirk Cousins. So yeah, I think Kirk Cousins is a perfectly fine start, but don't be surprised if he gives you 13 fantasy points. Don't be surprised if he gives you 18 or if he gets you 24. I mean, it's just what you get out of Kirk Cousins. A pretty safe floor on a weekly basis, although his floor on the season has been between 10 and 13 points. His ceiling has been between 19 and 23. And, you know, you're just going to get those wishy-washy performances from Kirk Cousins, but the Dolphins are just kind of in a banged up state of mind as a team, it seems like. So I do think it's a pretty good matchup at the end of the day, and I do think you can have confidence starting Kirk Cousins here in week 6. Teddy Two Gloves Bridgewater is still in concussion protocol, right? We know that Tua more than likely is not going to play here in week 6. Teddy Bridgewater suffered a concussion in week 5, forcing third-string quarterback Skylar Thompson to go into the game, who finished with 3.6 fantasy points. There is a possibility that Skylar Thompson gets his first start at the quarterback position for the Miami Dolphins in week 6. So really, I definitely don't like Skylar Thompson. We're not starting him. We know that, right? Teddy Bridgewater, I'm not purely confident in as well. I don't see a crazy high ceiling here, guys. Don't get me wrong. We saw some pretty good fantasy performances from Teddy Bridgewater last year, but I want to see it happen here in 2022 before we're throwing him into our starting lineup. So I'm going to sit the Dolphins quarterbacks moving into week 6. All right, Panthers at Rams. Please, God Almighty, do not start PJ Walker. He's rostered in 0% of fantasy leagues at the moment, and it needs to stay that way. There's no reason whatsoever to want to start PJ Walker. I will say this much: this could be positive for the Carolina Panthers with the quarterback play we're getting out of Baker Mayfield on the season. But regardless, we're not starting Walker in week 6. Let's move right along. Listen, guys, I have not been impressed with Matthew Stafford on the season. He's been ultimately extremely disappointing, coming in as your quarterback number 22 overall. But I do have an asterisk here because we've got a couple quarterbacks, mainly Derek Carr and Jared Goff, and then in some deeper Superflex double quarterback leagues, Tannehill as well. So if you have to roll with Matthew Stafford, I don't really hate it, right? We talked about Jimmy Garoppolo earlier in the video, and he had a pretty solid performance against his Panthers unit last week. And this is probably going to be a pretty positive game script for the Rams. I think this defense is going to have an absolutely beautiful day against the Panthers, who are now without their head coach, Matt Rule. You got Baker Mayfield going down. It's just not looking good for the Panthers overall. So I do think Stafford is in line to potentially have one of his best days on the season. But outside of week 2 against Atlanta, where he had 20.8 fantasy points, he has not had more than 11.3 fantasy points in every single matchup outside of that matchup against Atlanta. I mean, it's been absolutely atrocious. So I really don't have a ton of confidence, right? If Stafford's sitting on your bench, you roll with your other option. If Stafford is your only option, well, the game script at least should be positive for Stafford moving into week 6. All right, Cardinals at Seahawks. Man, I like this matchup. This is going to be a fun game. Both of these defenses really bending overall and giving up a good amount of points and just giving us good fantasy game scripts. You're starting Kyler Murray. He's your quarterback 5 on the season. Outside of week 3, he's giving us at least 17.2 fantasy points each game. In 3 of those performances, he's given us at least 20 fantasy points. Like I said, it's a great matchup versus the Seahawks. He's your quarterback 5, 250 passing yards in week 5 against Philly, 17.2 fantasy points, an interception, 42 yards on the ground. Going back to week 4 against Carolina, we just talked about 207 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 26 yards on the ground, and 1 rushing touchdown. I mean, you're starting Kyler Murray as your quarterback 5. Great matchup against the Hawks. Let's move right along to my guy, GENO Smith. We talked about him last week. We said it's time to put respect on GENO Smith's name, but I'm still not confident in starting him in week 5. Well, guess what? In week 5, GENO Smith had 24 fantasy points, 268 passing yards, 3 touchdowns overall. He's your quarterback 6 in fantasy football through the first 5 weeks of the 2022 fantasy football season. Guys, I'm over it. We are starting GENO Smith. Even if he gets us 8 points, I'm still impressed with GENO Smith. Listen, I like this matchup. I don't want him to get you 8 points, don't get me wrong. But overall, he's playing great football the last 3 weeks. 19 points in week 3, 31 in week 4, 24 in week 5. He had a bad performance against San Francisco in week 2, but they're one of the best defenses in the league. He had a pretty mediocre performance in week 1 against Denver at 16 fantasy points. But Denver is also one of the best defenses in the league, so I like him here in week 6 against Arizona. Fire him up. Get GENO Smith in your starting lineup. All right, Bills at Chiefs. This is probably your best game of the weekend. This is probably your best game from a fantasy perspective. This is going to be an absolute beauty to watch. We're going to see a lot of fantasy points in this matchup. You're starting Josh Allen, your quarterback one in fantasy football. There's no doubt about it. Doesn't matter who he's facing. 36.1 points in week 5, 424 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 42 yards on the ground. An absolutely phenomenal performance. And man, if the Bills had kept their foot on the gas pedal, this could have been a record-setting game. He did most of those stats before the third half even started. He had most of that accomplished by halftime. Josh Allen, just an absolute animal. You're starting him on a weekly basis. There's no discussion to be had there. Patty Mahomes is your quarterback 4 on the season. There's no discussion to be had here either. He's in your starting lineup on a weekly basis. His second best fantasy performance of the year in week 5 against Las Vegas. 30.4 fantasy points on the day of Monday Night Football. 292 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, all to Travis Kelce. 28 rushing yards. You're starting Mahomes. It's a beautiful matchup, guys. This is going to be a phenomenal game here in week 6. All right, Cowboys at Eagles. There is a chance Dak Prescott suits up in this matchup against the Eagles, bringing Cooper Rush's really nice run to an end. But even if he does suit up, I think we give Dak a week before we start him, because this is a tough matchup, right? Listen, I still have faith in Dak, don't get me wrong, but I have a lot more faith in this Philadelphia Eagles defense, right? So with Dak coming off of the injuries, I think we sit him here. Unless you're absolutely desperate, you could roll with Dak Prescott. He probably is going to give you a safe floor, but I'll give the hand to the Philadelphia Eagles defense. I like Prescott more in week 7 against Detroit and week 8 against Chicago. And if we don't see Prescott on the field, we're not starting Cooper Rush, who's doing a great job managing football games, but not giving us anything from a fantasy perspective. Jalen Hurts, on the other hand, is going to be a really interesting start on the week. He's your quarterback 3 in fantasy. You're starting him regardless of who he goes up against. Does not matter what the matchup is, but I would definitely say this is his toughest matchup on the season. So far, he's seen Detroit, Minnesota, Washington, Jacksonville, and Arizona. Really not great defenses in that mix. Outside of Jacksonville's been playing, I mean, the best out of the teams we just listed, and that was his worst performance of the season. So I absolutely think that this is his toughest matchup on the year, but it just really doesn't matter. I mean, 27.6 fantasy points in week 5 for Hurts, 239 passing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 61 rushing yards. You just have to start Hurts on a weekly basis. Don't get smart about it. We could still see Hurts get over 20 fantasy points against a unit as strong as the Dallas Cowboys defense. All right, Broncos at Chargers. Like I've said in every other start and sit video, another week, another primetime game for the Denver Broncos, the meanest offense in all of football. Russell Wilson should be ready for week 6, even though he's been playing through a shoulder injury that required a little bit of attention here in the long week. Maybe it's a PR stunt, maybe it's the truth. Who knows? The bottom line is, outside of week 4 against the Las Vegas Raiders, where Russell Wilson had 27.4 fantasy points, he has not netted more than 17 fantasy points. And in 3 out of those 4 matchups, he only netted you 12 or less fantasy points. He is quarterback 17 on the season. I'm not in love with Russell Wilson this week, but I've got him as a start because I do think that the Chargers are pretty vulnerable on the defensive side of the ball. And on top of that, you might see a couple teams out there who are kind of forced to start Russell Wilson. So maybe this is more of a streaming option. And I'll say this much. This is my last call to start Russell Wilson on the season if he does not give us 18, maybe 17 or more fantasy points. Right, I said that going into week 4. He gave us 27 points. I was pretty pleased. I thought he'd be okay. Last Thursday, he gave us 11 points, and did he look rough out there. So, listen, I'll give him one more nod against the Chargers. If he disappoints us, I'm out on Russell Wilson. I do have the asterisk there because of the potential injury and because I really have him more of a start because I know things are a little bit bleak for some leagues out there in terms of Goff and Carr being out on the week, and I guess maybe Ryan Tannehill or Davis Mills for that matter. Justin Herbert is a start for me, quarterback 10 on the season. He's netted you at least 21 fantasy points in 3 out of his 5 games on the season, but the 2 weeks where he hasn't, he's only giving you 12.5 and 14.4. I thought he'd have a much better day in week 5 against Cleveland, but he still threw for 228 passing yards and a touchdown. Listen, man, you just can't bench Justin Herbert. I'm really hoping to see some higher ceilings on the year. We'll see what happens. I do have an asterisk here, though, because it's a tough matchup. You know, the Denver Broncos offensively, it's been hot garbage, but when you look at this defense is monsters. This is one of the best defenses in the league. It's the most frustrating thing about the Denver Broncos because their defense is doing their job 110%, but the offense can't do a damn thing. Anyways, listen, if you have more than one quarterback on your team, this might be a lower ceiling week for Justin Herbert. You could consider another quarterback, but at the same time, man, if you own Herbert, I don't want to bench him. So I've got him as a start, but be a little bit wary because I really do believe in this Denver Broncos defense, but I also believe in Justin Herbert and this Chargers offense moving into week 6. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.